thank you very much. It's morning on my side, but I know it's afternoon on yours. So good afternoon to everyone, to students, to faculty, to everyone watching. I'm really, really sorry that I cannot be physically with you. It would have been a great honor and pleasure, and I hope that I will travel to India. India plays a very, very important role at the global stage in terms of this digital transformation that we're all going through at global scale. I would really like to see us on the EU side and India interacting more and more as we all go through this transformation. But let's get back to artificial intelligence, and I'll try to answer some of the questions that were asked to me by the organizers of this conference. First of all, why did we decide to regulate this technology in the EU when most other jurisdictions, in fact, all other jurisdictions for the time being, have chosen not to? And I think it is an important question that I will address. Then the approach that we took in regulating AI, then the issue of, and you mentioned it in the introduction, what does it mean for our democracies? What does it mean for the sovereignty of states? Also the challenges related to implementation, and towards the end, something that again is very important, which is the international dimension, not only of the effort that we've done on the EU side in terms of putting forward the normative framework for AI, but also what does it mean for the rest of the world? What does it mean for other jurisdictions? Will we see the famous Brussels effect, as it's called, which is that legislation that we pass as a novelty in the EU tends to become standard for other jurisdictions to follow, but also more globally, how do we endeavor to reach that sort of a more global convergence in terms of governing this technology that, as was said already in the introduction, is indeed transforming our lives. It is transforming our societies, it is transforming our economies, and I think more than any other piece of technology in the past, more than in any other industrial revolutions that humanity witnessed in the past, this is also a technology that sits at the heart of the geopolitical framing right now, and is going to sit more and more at the heart of the geopolitical positioning of the various actors on the global stage. Why? It is because of that impact that I mentioned earlier on everything in every sector of human activity, of economic activity, but also certainly with an enormous impact also in terms of security, defense policies, defense capabilities in the future. So, and I will start by addressing why, the first question, why did we choose to regulate? Well, to a large extent because of its impact, what I just said before. We realized at the EU level in discussions that started way before the moment when we announced back in 2019 that we will start preparing the legislation, there were expert groups at the European Commission level that had started already years prior to that to look into the various implications of artificial intelligence and starting to realize indeed how impactful, how transformative this technology was. And then came the question of, okay, if it is indeed so transformative, if it is indeed so impactful, can we afford to work only with the self-discipline of companies developing and deploying these technologies in our societies, in our economies, so on and so forth? Is the approach that we had taken with social media, for example, prior to that, in terms of disinformation, in terms of the impact on the health of our democracies, and when we relied solely on codes of conduct, on companies saying, listen, we are going to respect some principles of ethics when we roll these technologies into our markets, into our societies. And then again, we ask the question, are we okay, are we enough if we just work with general principles, with voluntary commitments, and again, with the goodwill of companies? And our answer back in 2019 was a very clear, no, it's not enough. And if we indeed wanted to see a change of behavior, a different level of accountability for the companies that were developing artificial intelligence or putting it into production, deploying it in various contexts in our lives in our societies, then we need to put some clearer rules in place. And it wasn't just us thinking that. What was very interesting with this piece of legislation, and as you've heard, I had accompanied this piece of legislation from its very inception when the President of the European Commission announced it in her inaugural speech in Parliament in 2019. At that very moment, I said, this is it, this is my file. And I had accompanied this file both in its preparation and after it has reached us as legislators. So from the very beginning, we had been hearing constantly from all stakeholders, including industry, many think that this was a piece of regulation that was done against the industry or against its interest. In fact, I think the majority of representatives of industry, big and small, European, American, Indian, etc., was that they themselves wanted to have the certainty of a standard when developing AI, because they were feeling themselves that apart from the enormous benefits, from the enormous potential that this technology has, there were also certain potential harms, certain risks that were associated with the development and deployment of the technology, particularly in certain contexts where it was coming very directly in intersection, let's say, not necessarily in conflict, but touching upon our rights as individuals, as citizens, and also the broader interests of society, and therefore some clear framework, some guidelines, some guardrails. This word guardrails is used a lot because it also, I think, explains very well, advocates very well how we approach these rules as guardrails, as something that would guide necessarily rather than restrain. And again, once we have asked ourselves and answered ourselves this question as to whether hard rules are necessary versus voluntary commitments and principles, then the question was how to do it. So we said, okay, we want to put these rules in place, but how do we do it? How do we best do it to achieve that balance, which we also, from the very start, we assumed that we had to have this balance between the interest to protect citizen society, our democracy, from the potential harms and risks of artificial intelligence, but balance it with the need to foster innovation, to put the enablers in place so that whatever rules we make that are aimed to protect are not coming too much at the cost of creativity, of innovation, of growth based on AI, because we also realize very well that, again, this technology is going to be the driver of human endeavor, of our economies, of our growth in the decades to come. So again, this was the overall rationale back in 2019 when the decision as to whether we go down the path of regulation was taken. Then the question was, what approach did we take? And that's when, again, after turning literally almost every stone back then, looking at what the technology was doing, how it was, again, used in different settings, we realized that trying to regulate the technology itself would be impossible and also wrong as an approach. Not only because the technology ultimately, no matter how sophisticated it is still a tool. It is a tool in human hands, and therefore a tool is blunt. A tool is neutral, and therefore you can't regulate the tool, but you have to regulate its use. So again, once we have decided that this is the approach, when we looked at the use of this technology, at the context in which it is deployed, we realized that the only way, again, to address that use is to look at the risks that it is potentially inducing in our societies and economies. And therefore we said, okay, let's look at the risks, let's identify these risks, and let's categorize the different uses, the different contexts in which AI is being developed and deployed, and then put those contexts in a framework of risk. So this is the famous risk-based approach that you hear when it's being referred to the AI Act. And then we identified those applications of AI that are coming so much in conflict with the values that we try to protect, with this regulation that we simply said these applications, we just don't want to see them in our societies at all. They are so detrimental that we just want to ban them. So you have a list of prohibitions in the AI Act, which means that those uses of AI, it's not that the technology behind those uses is prohibited, because I have heard this misinterpretation often. EU is banning biometric technology. No, biometric technology will continue to be developed, will continue to be deployed in various contexts in the EU, because it is a technology that is very useful in certain contexts. But what we say, for example, is that biometric technology, facial recognition used to survey in public spaces in real time is prohibited. It's just one example. Or profiling in the way of social scoring, and I open a bracket here to give an example, which is what we know China is doing on a massive scale towards its citizens. Again, we said this is incongruent with the values in our society, and therefore we prohibit it. Predictive policing, another example. In other words, inferring that someone might commit or recommit a crime based solely on the amalgamation of an algorithm based on data that almost always tends to be biased, discriminatory. Again, this is something that we say we don't want to see in our society. Emotional recognition in an educational environment or in a workspace. In other words, again, inferring consequences on the basis of what an algorithm might perceive to be myself sitting angrily behind a desk, or yourselves sitting in a classroom, and an algorithm guessing whether I'm upset with my professor, and therefore inferring some consequences from that. Again, these are the contexts where we say AI does not have a place in our society for the use in this context, because it comes too much in conflict with how we perceive the values important for us, and the privacy and those things that are for us as citizens in the EU important. Then comes a second layer of high risk applications, which means that they can be produced, they can be put on the market, they can be used, but they have to be accompanied by certain conditions, by certain conformity requirements, which ultimately means transparency, means explainability towards myself, yourselves as users. So if I'm a user of technology, I need to have confidence that I understand, again, in those contexts that are considered to be high risk, that I understand how it works, why it gives the recommendations that it gives, why it puts forward the decisions that it puts forward. And here the contexts are, again, those that where technology and humans are interacting, in the banking sector, in the insurance sector, in the health sector, in the education sector, in elections. So again, in those contexts where us as humans come of a service provider, and an algorithm would be making recommendations that are impacting my rights. A bank is using an algorithm to judge my creditworthiness and to decide that I'm getting a credit at this rate or at that rate. Well, I want to make sure that the data that was used to train that algorithm, for example, was a data that was curated, that was clean for potential discrimination bias, because I don't want to be judged simply because I'm sitting in that corner of the city and not in that corner of the city. And depending on that, I get the credit at a higher rate than my fellow citizen who sits maybe in a wealthier part of the town. It is those sort of inferences that I do not want an algorithm to use when making decisions that are, again, impacting my rights. Same thing if an algorithm is used to send my children to a school in that neighborhood or in that neighborhood. I do not want it. I want to make sure, I want to have the trust that the data that was used in training the algorithm, the instructions given by the code writer of that algorithm, again, I need that explainability, I need a transparency to make sure that, again, bias is not creeping into the way algorithms are trained and are working, that there is a data governance in place that makes sure that there is a good control, a good governance of the data that is used to train the algorithms, so on and so forth. And ultimately, and this brings me to an important point about democracy, ultimately, all of this effort is about trust. This is the key word that we have to understand it sits at the heart of this regulation. And it is coming from our understanding that if society is to embrace this technology, if society is to accept the fact that it's going to come alongside, sometimes maybe even replace our jobs, that is going to be part of our education of our children in the future. It is already, but it's going to become more and more. That is going to be present in, again, everything that we do, and everywhere we turn, we're going to be around AI. Well, then we need to trust it. And this is not only in the interest of us as citizens, it is also in the interest of those that are developing and deploying the technology, because they know themselves that without society trusting this technology, there will be no uptake. And if there is no uptake of the technology, again, you don't realize the full potential and the full benefits of the technology. So it's all interlinked in a way, and it's all building and developing around the concept of trust. That's why we call trustworthy AI as being the ultimate product of this effort that we've made regulating AI. Because with trustworthiness, with trust in AI, then it can also reap its benefit and at the same time protect society from its potential harms. So starting from trust, the issue of how we look at democracy, or how we protect in democracy, this is both an implicit and explicit. Explicitly, again, we have listed democracy, elections, processes that are linked to elections as contexts that are high risk, and therefore the use of AI when impacting these contexts is a high risk, therefore needs to come with guardrails and conditions. But there is also an implicit link with democracy, because almost everything is about preserving our democracy and ushering in this technology in a way that makes it aligned with our understanding of democratic values. This is again key to understand, because you can look at this technology also with different lenses, and I will come back to that at the end when I speak about international dimension. So it is also about values. It is fundamentally about democratic values, because it is starting from those values that we want to protect that we have extrapolated the kind of rules, the kind of framework that we want to put in place in order to protect those values. Is there also an issue of sovereignty, was one of the questions that was asked. It is in several layers, and unfortunately we don't have enough time today to peel all of these layers, because it's a very, very interesting topic, this one. It's also linked to the fact that states in particular have never been so vulnerable in any of the previous industrial revolutions that we've gone through, have never been so vulnerable, so exposed than they are right now. For the simple reason that states are controlling very little, in fact, of what is going on in this AI transformation. A lot of the key commodities and resources for this new transformation, for this new industrial revolution, are not sitting in the hands of the states. They are sitting in the hands of private sectors. There is a lot of power in its raw sense, not only smooth power. It is power in the raw sense that is being accumulated in the hands of private sector, of companies that are holding most of the compute power that is necessary to train these algorithms, that are holding the data that is necessary to train these algorithms, that are often also holding the keys to some of the connectivity infrastructure that is necessary to transport data. So there's a very key fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves as to what is the role of state in the future digital world in which we are now slowly moving into. How do states, governments need to adapt themselves to face this transformation so that they continue to have the relevance that they need to have in a democracy to maintain the social contract? Because, you know, democracies are relying on a social contract. That means there's a quid pro quo, right? I, as a citizen, I'm accepting the authority that comes from the state because you state are giving me certain things. And if that social contract somehow gets too uneven, or that balance that is tipped too much in the wrong way, and the states do not know how to rebalance it, looking at, again, what is their role and how do they themselves adapt to this technological transformation, then again, there is a fundamental vulnerability in there that needs to be very quickly addressed. And this brings me also to the challenge of implementation that I mentioned that I will address. And as we have now approached the very end of the legislative process, and we are literally at the very end, or 2 weeks from now, we're going to have the final vote in the parliament, which is going to basically put an end to the normative process. It is when the law will be considered officially adopted, and then we're moving into implementation. An implementation that has a transition period of 24 months with several stages in between. Why? Because, again, we understood the complexity of what it means to implement it both at EU level as well as at the national level, because the competencies are on 2 layers. There's a layer of competence at EU wide level, particularly for the interaction with the big platforms, particularly when it comes to what is being called as frontier models or foundational models. This is where there is an exclusive competence for the future EU AI office that will act as the European level regulator. But for the more, let's call them mundane risks, for the day-to-day interaction between citizens and AI being developed and deployed out there, the competence is left at state level. And with the basic understanding I have of how the Indian governance and democracy works, I think it's not very distinct from the type of competences that you have at state level in India versus let's call it the federal. So in that similar fashion, we have these 2 layers. Member states will have to now prepare their national authorities, their national regulators that will pick up competences in dealing with AI, in dealing with the high risks of AI, in enforcing it, in making sure that they have the interaction, speaking also of the innovation part of the regulation, with the companies, that they put the sandboxes in place to allow for testing, for trial and error of companies that are putting higher risk applications on the market. So there's a whole ecosystem that now needs to be developed, and this is where the challenge is. The challenge is that, okay, we have given 2 years to governments at national level, also to the EU governance level to be prepared, but it's going to be an enormous challenge in finding the right talent, attracting the talent necessary, and come and work on government salaries, knowing that this market is a highly competitive market where the private sector, speaking of what I was saying earlier about who holds the resources, the private sector tends to absorb the vast majority of the talent out there when it comes to developing AI. And you will need these kind of people that are speaking this language to be able to sit in the national regulators and the EU regulator if you want the implementation of the regulation to go according to the spirit that we have built in it as lawmakers. So this is going to be a very important part of the puzzle in implementing it. And then it is the actual challenge of implementing in 27 different settings. We have 27 different member states. Ensuring coherence between the interpretation, between the implementation is going to be very important. I have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to now move on to the international dimension of this, which is extremely important. And I said it from the very beginning. It was I think in the very first hearing that I organized as chair of the Special Committee on AI, I said, we cannot do this alone, even if we are the first jurisdiction that picks up this challenge. And it was likely back then, and it proved to be the case, I was saying back then, it was likely that we will be the first ones past the bar, making this choice and seeing it all the way through the end. But we cannot be neither complacent nor arrogant about this. In other words, we should not be counting solely on what I was saying earlier, the Brussels effect, i.e. that we put the regulation out there, and simply because we are the first ones and possibly for a while the only ones regulating it, that it will somehow cascade into this Brussels effect where other jurisdictions or companies that are developing things for the EU market will be simply replicating the same EU model of a platform or of an application in other jurisdictions as well. And I said that we should not be relying solely on that because I looked at it as a global phenomena this transformation happens in the same way everywhere. The technology is the same everywhere. The interaction with societies, particularly with democracies, that again are understanding values in the same way. This is why I was saying at the beginning that democracy and democratic values are very important here. Then inevitably the conversation will have to be global. And we will have to also do what I called back then AI diplomacy. We'll have to reach out towards the other democracies out there, but also the half democracies or the non-democracies out there, because even they, again, are working with the same technology. So at some point, it is not only an effort of the democratic countries that have to figure out what is the right governance at the global level for this. We will also have to talk to China about this. And to all those that maybe have a different understanding of what AI and how it plays into the societies, but still, again, they are actors on the global stage in this AI transformation, and therefore there will also have to be an active dialogue with them. And as you probably know, there are right now various settings in which AI is being discussed at the top level. Finally, 3-4 years ago, I often felt alone when I was raising some of the, not only the daily risks, but also the broader societal and global implications of AI. Well, it took ChatGPT to wake up the whole world and our leaders as to the true impact and the true power and what it can actually do, both for the good and for the bad. And now, as you probably saw, there are summits mushrooming everywhere. There are frameworks, bilateral, multilateral, that are mushrooming everywhere, which is not a bad thing. But what we'll have to do is a well, carefully planned and thought through effort of joining up all of these frameworks into a governance that ensures not convergence, because convergence is too strong of a word. We'll have to accept diversity of approaches between different jurisdictions in terms of what kind of rules they'll put in place, how hard law versus soft law they will be. There are common law systems and civil law systems. You as students in law understand that very well, and therefore also the detail, how prescriptive legislation is very different between one type of system and another. But we have to look and accept this diversity while trying to achieve, again, convergence maybe is too strong a word, but an equivalent functional effect of alignment and interoperability between the different normative systems or artificial intelligence, because that is the only way, from my point of view, how we can achieve a governance at global level where we can actually speak the same language, understanding it in the same way, with the same concepts, with the same overall principles and objectives in mind. I think that the seeds for this global approach are planted. As you know, probably the UN also has right now an advisory group that is tasked until summer to bring a report to propose this sort of a framework that would bring all of our other frameworks in together. And I think it's a good way to do it, because it brings everyone, all jurisdictions, around the same table, and hopefully also around a similar approach. And at the same time, the existing bilateral channels or multilateral channels, I think, should also continue. As far as the EU-India relations are concerned, there is let's say, a similar trade and technology council as the one that we had launched with the US some 4 years ago. And I'm happy that there is this TTC. I think we need to use and explore this framework all the way to the end. AI is firmly anchored into that framework, because I think there is a lot to, not only there's a lot to discuss about, but I think there's also a lot to exchange and a lot to learn from each other, and that learning experience will go both ways. I will stop here, and unfortunately, I have a hard stop because I need to run to another meeting. So it's really been an honor and pleasure to talk to you. Many thanks to Professor Reddy and the team for inviting me, and I look forward, who knows, in the future to another interaction with you. Thank you.
Mr. Tudorache, thank you very much for this overview, not just on the EU AI Act, but also the whole preparation that went behind. and also what we should be doing together, the AI diplomacy, and how India and EU should be building on from where the EU AI starts. I know that probably you are into another meeting, but if there's a question or two, would you be able to take? Or okay, you're already saying bye. So.
Unfortunately, I don't have time for questions. Sorry about that.
No, I think you've covered everything that is required. You've answered whatever we've been discussing since yesterday and today. So thank you very much, sir, and a big round of applause again. Thank you, sir.